Good evening, everyone, and well done for making it through all the negotiations of WOMAD and the Fringe and everything else that's going on. There's a real buzz around campus, but it does mean negotiating one's way is a little more challenging than usual. So my name's Professor Jenny Short. I'm Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide. I would first like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and on the lands on which the University of Adelaide campuses are built. And thank you all for coming along to tonight's Research Tuesdays event, Typewriter, or Typewriter. Tonight we have the honour of hearing from three great University of Adelaide writers. And you'll hear from them all very shortly. Dr. Matthew Hooton is a lecturer in English and Creative Writing in the School of Humanities and part of the University of Adelaide's Faculty of Arts. Matt, would you just stand for a minute? They're not going to hear from you for a little while, so put a name and a face to the name I'm saying. So Matt has already published one novel, Delem Road, with a second entitled Typhoon Kingdom, set for publication in April. He has also written short fiction and creative non-fiction for a variety of international publications. Jill, I am going to ask you to stand briefly, although we'll hear from you very shortly. So Jill Jones is a senior lecturer, thanks Jill, in English and Creative Writing in the School of Humanities and a member of the J.M. Coetzee Centre for Creative Practice in the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide. Jill is a former winner of the Mary Gilmore Award for Best Debut Poetry Publication, an award of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, and the Kenneth Stosworth Poetry Prize, which is one of the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Jill's work is widely published in Australia and internationally, with collections of her poetry translated into 6 languages. And Heather, lucky last, if you could stand for us too. Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Heather Taylor-Johnson is a research fellow with the university's J.M. Coetzee Centre for Creative Practice. The author of 2 published novels and 4 books of poetry, her work has received critical acclaim. This includes, in 2017 alone, winning a Griffith Review Novella Prize, being shortlisted for the Newcastle Poetry Prize, and having a work included in Black's Best Australian Poems. So, to the format for tonight, Jill is going to start us off with a brief introduction on behalf of the panel, and then as a group, we will engage in a Q&A discussion. There'll be time at the end for any burning questions that you have, and we'll invite you to get involved at that point. So let's get underway, and Jill, I'll ask you to come up.
I just wanted to give a little bit of context with the three of us. As you would have noticed from the introduction that Jenny gave, we don't stick to one brand of writing. And writers in general, and certainly the three of us, have had to or have wanted to turn our hand to various kinds of writing, whether it's poetry, short stories, novels, and all the rest. And that's the sort of thing that writers often have to do. And writing, I wanted to emphasise, in a good way, is actually work. We actually work at what we do. We research it and we write it and then we publish it. And it's actually a way of making something. We make a page, we make a book, we make something that might sit on a screen, we might make a performance. And those of us who write for various reasons think a lot about this writing as making, and I hope that we'll get to talk a little bit more about it. But it's a physical activity where we actually make an object. And despite all the prognostication, let's just talk a little bit about the object just for a minute. Whether it's physical or digital, and I don't know how many of you actually read digitally, but I'm sure everyone here has at least read, if not continues to read, the actual physical page book. The book isn't dead yet. I was looking up some sales figures. Publishers are very cagey about sales figures, but in general we can say book sales in Australia are up marginally. In the US in 2018 they sold more books than they did in 2017, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12 and 11. But then there was a big year before then. In the UK, apparently, according to The Guardian, sales are booming, whatever that means. But the other thing to notice is authors' incomes are falling. So the money is going elsewhere, and that's something that's probably worth thinking about as well. And of course, readers are reading across many platforms, we know that, and anecdotally non-fiction seems to be experiencing higher sales than fiction. I can state for a fact that poetry is not a bestseller, absolutely not. But being a writer isn't necessarily about making a bestseller. It's a profession in the very broadest sense of the word. We profess writing. And and we find various ways to do it, whether we're writing the very popular or writing the very niche. Writers are trying to say something, particularly creative writers, in story form or in poem, in play, and in various other forms. And we know that writers, although some writers have very quiet lives, and there's their inner life and their experience of watching and looking to do things, we also know that writers write out of deep trauma, illness, sickness, disability, and all those things. Of course, we think writers get killed for writing. Think of really famous examples. Of course, we think of Anne Frank and her diary. We think recently Behrouz Boochani, incarcerated for many years on Manus Island, won an important literary award just recently for his book, which was written partly by using WhatsApp and sending messages out from Manus. We know that the French journalist Jean-Dominique Bauby wrote The Diving Bell and the Butterfly after he'd been struck down by a stroke and had locked-in syndrome. Still wrote. Writers still keep writing whatever it is. So without ado, let's get going and talking about more writing.
Great, thanks, Jill. And look, you mentioned writing is a profession, and that's, I think we're kind of preaching to the converted here. But if you talk to a number of people outside this kind of environment of writing, and we've just had Writers' Week, often people will say, well, that's a nice hobby, but what do you do for a job? What's your career? And I think for professional writers, sometimes it's very hard to explain what they do. Is it a vocation? Is it a calling? Is it something you've just fallen into? So I'm interested in asking all three of you, perhaps starting with Heather, when did you start thinking of yourself as a professional writer?
I think, is this on? Yep. I think it's it's important to delineate that that all writers are readers as well. So you're a reader and a writer, and it took me a long time to actually think that being a reader was okay, let alone a writer. Sometimes I feel like I'm still just relaxing if I'm reading, but it's such an important part of my day. As far as saying I'm a writer, I still say I'm just a writer. I'm just a writer. Because I think I struggle a lot with wanting to be an academic and proving that I'm clever, and then not wanting to be an academic and then saying, oh, but then I just write. And I'm not quite sure when I'm going to get rid of that just. I have accepted I'm a writer, but yeah, I guess I haven't grabbed hold of it yet.
What about you, Matt? What stage are you at?
Yeah, I mean, some of what Jill said really resonated with me, in that I tend not to think of myself as a writer so much as about writing as something that I do. It's a practice. It's something that I engage in. And so I like to talk about it as something that I'm passionate about. But it took me a really long time to admit that passion and to sort of own it in any sort of meaningful way. I grew up in small towns, in logging towns on Vancouver Island in Canada, and I survived that by playing sports, but I can tell you that no one in my immediate circles wanted to know about the secret poems and short stories about gay lumberjacks that I was writing at the time. And that sort of sense of almost shame, I think, was so intense in those places, in those communities, that I didn't even apply for university out of high school, and it was I guess a stroke of fortune. I completely destroyed my right knee playing sports in my final year of high school, and I took a creative writing class as an elective because I couldn't do physical education to fulfill my graduation requirements. And I had a creative writing teacher in high school with the fictional sounding name of George Biggs come to me at the end of the year and tell me that he wanted me to apply for university and to study creative writing. And I laughed him out of the room, and he left and came back 15 minutes later with a university application form, filled out completely, a portfolio of my work ready to send to the creative writing program at the University of Victoria in Canada. And he told me that if I didn't sign the application form, he would fail me and I wouldn't graduate from high school. So it took a really, really strong push for me to sort of own that passion and that desire to be involved in art, really.
And Jill, you've had a long career. So again, do you remember when you thought of yourself as a professional writer?
That's a really good question. Probably not for a while. I, like a lot of people, in fact one of my students admitted it today, well, I won't characterise her poetry, but I wrote the usual bad poetry when I was at high school and university, angst and all the rest of it, and then I gave it away. But I became involved with a group of people, who were interested in songwriting. I wrote one song which was terrible, but interested in words and what you make with words. And then I started writing a diary, which wasn't just about my own feelings, but what I could see around me. And all of a sudden, the diary entries started to become poems, and I was with a group of people who were reading a lot of the new, this is way back, American poetry, which was just sort of flooding into Australia. And all of a sudden I found that I wasn't that worried about my own feelings. I actually wanted to make something that took those feelings and observations and put them somewhere else and did something else with them. Then I started to think, maybe I could get this published, and some of it got published, and that's how it started to happen. Yeah.
Mm. And Matt, you mentioned you think of as writing as a practice, something that you do. And I'm interested, and I imagine a number of people in the room would be, in how do you start? So I'm going to ask again, probably all three of you, but starting with Matt, how do you start? What's the physical or the mental activity you need, or the stimulus, or is it holding something in your hand? Is it physical? Is it mental? What gets you going?
Well, you're all in my next short story, whether you like it or not. Some of you will be aliens, some of you won't escape, but this is the price you pay for being here. I mean, the actual process of sitting down for me is a pencil and a pad of paper. And I just really appreciate the sort of tactile nature of that. The smell of pencil sharpenings just really helped me sort of mentally prepare for writing. And I like the scratching of graphite on paper. So it's a very physical process, as Jill mentioned, for me. But ideas come from everywhere. They come from specific research, directed research, experiences like this, meeting people, travel, and you never really know how things are going to filter, I don't think.
Mm. Heather, how do you get going?
So with poetry, I never write a poem ever without reading a slew of poems when I sit down. So I have it in my head that today I'm going to write a poem, and I've got this many hours to do it before the kids come home and that sort of thing. But it always starts with reading first. As far as a novel goes, I'm in a really sort of charmed place right now with novel writing, because I'm doing the bit I love the most, which is editing, doing the second edit of the novel, which I love. And around this time, I start thinking about the next novel. And that's like a 2-year gestation. And so it's quite exciting to be thinking of something and what you can do with it when at the same time I'm tidying up something that I just obsessively spent so much time over. So yeah, different forms, different ways of going about it.
And Jill, you mentioned keeping a diary, but for you, is it like Matt? Is it something where you need to start with pencil and paper?
Yeah, pretty much so. Or I'm a bit old-fashioned. I've got a fountain pen, and so that ink is almost like the blue or black or whatever blood of writing, and I sadly have a stationery fetish. And so I've got lots of notebooks, but that actual putting the words down onto paper and watching it flow out, even if the beginning words are sort of just, not terribly good, the actual physicality of doing this gets, the fluids moving, the sort of head fluid and the bodily fluid, the thinking fluid, yeah. And then it may come down to doing some research, or perhaps I'm just out and about and I see something, and sometimes I have to stop and sort of write it down. Someone said something on the bus. I travel on the W90 every day, and you'd be surprised what people say on the bus. Or you'd be surprised what you see out of the bus, and I write it down. And it might become something in a poem. Throwing things around.
Now, Heather, you alluded to when the kids come home. So what about balancing life and art? Is that something that you have, do you think you've mastered? Is it something you have to struggle to maintain that balance?
I mean, they're getting older every year, and it's getting easier every year to find time.
I think they're here, aren't they?
Yeah. I think one thing that was new this year, last year, I've been working on a novel which is a fictional case of some Australians who go to New York and get caught up in a gun massacre at the Guggenheim. And that was really hard to separate from my home life because of the research that I was doing, which was just horrific. And I just felt very angry about, I come from America, I felt very angry about what was going on in America, and I just found it difficult to turn off when everybody got home. And I was very short that year, and very impatient, and yeah, so that was hard to separate. But I have a friend who's a social worker, and I think, how did she do it? How did she come home and separate that part of her life from her family? And I think some people are very good at doing that, and others struggle a bit, so.
I suppose the difference with a social worker is that she has a workplace to go to, whereas I imagine that all of you would do a fair bit of your writing at home. So your
fair, yeah.
home and your workplace are the one entity.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. I try to, keep my backyard separate to writing. When I go inside, that's home life. But the backyard's a nice sort of haven.
And Jill, what about the work-life balance for you? Do you think you've managed it over the years?
Over the years, sometimes not. Certainly, I feel the privilege of working at the university where I teach creative writing and I am a creative writer. Obviously, at certain times in the semester, my focus is on students and teaching. But even in the class, I was teaching all today, and although I was talking to the students and responding to what their responses were to the poems I was showing them, I was also thinking, yes, it is actually interesting what Emily Dickinson is doing in this poem. I wonder, thinking while they're looking at it, I wonder if I could do something like that as well. So sometimes you sort of work like that, you can sort of bridge it. But sometimes, you're right, even at the university, it's best to leave that office in the Napier building and go to the home office and do the writing. And and that's one way of making the separation, the home office and the work office. Yeah.
And Matt, have you managed that separation as well? Do you struggle with that, or have you managed to delineate the part where you create and the part where everything else happens, or they merge?
Well, yes, it's always a struggle. There's no getting around that. I don't know if I've ever met an artist of any kind who doesn't really have a hard time sort of managing to find time for art. And this comes back to what I said at the beginning about really being passionate about it. No matter what job I've done, I've always found time to write. And if that means getting up at 5 a.m., if that means staying up late to write, if that means working through weekends, that's just what I'm going to do because I love it, because I care about it, because I take so much joy from the process. And that doesn't mean that it isn't difficult, it isn't frustrating and all the rest of it. It just means that there's joy there as well. And it really is about the process for me. You know, anytime it becomes a means to an end, anytime I become focused on publishing, I become focused on income from writing, awards, grants, anything like that, it starts to just eat away at that joy. And I lose sight of the need to be present in the art, the need to be practicing regularly, the need to be disciplined. And it doesn't matter to me if I never get published again in my life, I'm still going to write. That's all there is to it. I made that decision a couple decades ago, sometime after George Biggs threatened me. And it's not going to change. So it really is just a matter of blocking that out. And I'm quite lucky to be employed by this university now and to have some time allocated in my week for writing, even if that sort of goes out the window at the start of semester, et cetera.
Well, I wonder, Heather mentioned she was researching trauma and grief and having to deal with that and deal with home life. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Typhoon Kingdom and the kind of things that you were dealing with when you were researching and writing your book.
Sure, thank you. So this is the novel that I've been working on for about the past 5 years, and it's coming out hopefully next month here in Australia. And it's set in 2 time periods in Korea, on the Korean peninsula. The first is in the 17th century with a shipwreck. A Dutch East India Company ship wrecks off the coast, and there's an adventure that unfolds. The second part is 300 years later, and this takes place during the Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula and then into the Korean War. And one of my characters in that second part is a Korean woman that was taken as a sex slave by the Japanese military. And this made up a huge part of my PhD research as well. And engaging with this traumatic history, the reality that these women faced was really quite challenging on a whole pile of different levels. It was challenging for me as an artist and an academic. Issues of cultural appropriation, whether or not I was the right person to tell that story, all of those things were really difficult. But I also found that just the emotional side of immersing myself in these histories, in these stories, indeed meeting some of the surviving women and talking to them and hearing their stories, it really started to take an emotional toll over time. And I have all sorts of sort of practical ways of dealing with that. I have a great partner, a great support network. There's yoga, there's meditation, there's all sorts of other things that one can do to help with forgetting. But the other thing that I do artistically is I try to switch focus regularly and work on smaller projects. So if I'm in the middle of a novel that I know I'm going to be immersed in for years and years, I try to just switch gears and write a short story every few months. So, you know, I have a short story coming out this month in Southerly in Sydney that's about Jim Henson and his Muppets, and the Russian dancer Rudolf Nureyev, who danced on the Muppet Show with a pig in a tutu, of course. And even if those other stories are serious, etc., there's still a break from that, and I find that giving myself that space is really, really helpful on an emotional level.
Thank you. I'm sure we have a number of aspiring writers and surely many avid readers in the audience. So I'm wondering if you each probably have lots of advice that you could give, but I'm wondering in particular, and Jill, I'll start with you, how do you deal with failure?
Yes, that's sometimes the key question. I remember many years ago, the great Australian, the late but great Australian poet Dorothy Porter, sorry, I always get my Dorothys mixed up, Dorothy Porter saying that as a writer, when you get that rejection slip, you have every right to say whatever rude and crude words you want to say for 5 minutes. You're allowed that. And then you look at it again look at what you sent or look at what you did. This is in a certain context, but in general, at what you did and what do you learn from it, and what can you make better in what you do. And I mean, this might sound like an ideal situation, 5 minutes sort of cursing and swearing and then getting on with it. But to an extent, that's what you do have to do. You don't necessarily forget the rejection. You don't forget things, but you just keep moving forward. Or you don't forget the failure. You might be experimenting or researching something and it just doesn't quite go anywhere. But the other thing to remember is it's all been writing anyway. Maybe there is a little something that you can salvage from it and turn it around and place it somewhere else and build something out of it, or add it into another thing that's not working, and all of a sudden the two things do work. So there are ways around it, but you do actually allow yourself that space to sort of have a couple of curses and then move on.
Well, Matt, it sounds like you had a high school teacher who didn't want you to fail, but all writers I know have to experience that. So what was it like the first time?
There's just been so many rejections, I can't even remember the first one. It's hard, and I suppose there's an extent to which it doesn't get easier. We want people to love our art. That's totally natural, of course we do. But I think I just have to take issue with this word failure. Again, it has to be about the process. It has to be about engaging with this art because it's something that we love. And since that's the case for me, more and more I feel like a day that I've engaged with my art, a day that I've practiced writing, is a success. And that really is the long and the short of it. And I think I have absolutely no control over anything else. I mean, that's not to say that I'm not going to take editorial advice and keep refining my art and keep working on that. But I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about that other than that it doesn't have to be about developing a thick skin, I don't think. I don't really believe in that. I think that we are emotional creatures and we put that into our art, and it's okay to experience that, maybe even for more than 5 minutes. But I have no control over whether or not an editor loves my work or whether you like my work. So to hell with it. I don't know.
Heather, where do you stand on that issue? And I think I would think of sometimes, I know as a musician, sometimes you try something yourself. It's not at that point of sending it out to the public world, but you have an idea, you try it, and it doesn't work. So how do you deal with those kind of failures? Are you able to turn it into something else, like Jill mentioned, or do you set it aside and start something afresh?
So when I'm rejected, I'm very much about tenacity, and there have been some rejections that have hurt a lot, but they're so few, because the majority of rejections actually kind of excite me and thrill me, because I think, oh, well, now how am I going to fix this up, or who am I going to send it to now? And I get quite excited about the task that's ahead of me, because I think I do see sending things out as a task. Turning things into something else. I did get a rejection recently, and it did make me think that it wasn't ready, and I've been looking at my timeline and realizing that it probably needs a couple more years. That's a big, that was sort of a big moment to take that one in. But it wasn't an easy fix. I'll tell a little bit of a story about just tenacity, I think. So my first novel was published because it won an award called the Varuna HarperCollins Award. So I got to go to a residency, a writer's residency, and work with an editor from HarperCollins, and they said, you know, we like this book, but it really needs this, and it was a great experience. And I came home after the residency and I kept working on it and I sent it in and they said, okay, we'll publish it. But what was interesting about that is that when I first sent that novel in, I sent it into 3 awards and it didn't make a long list for any of those 3 awards. And one of the awards was actually the HarperCollins Bruno Award. And eventually the judges of the award got back to me and said, we know you weren't longlisted, but in fact, the publishers weren't happy with our shortlist that we sent them, so they asked us for more manuscripts. So we gave them all of them, and they chose yours. And so I think it's just really important to remember that there's so much luck involved, and if you do just keep sending out and sending out and sending out, eventually you're going to nail it. It's the right person at the right time so often. So, tenacity is, that's my thing.
So I think, Jill, you'd probably agree with that, with tenacity being one of the
Oh, yes, you've just got to keep,
pillars.
keep revising the work or knowing when to set it aside, because sometimes you can't do anything with it. And I've had things sitting around for 20 years and all of a sudden I think, oh, now is the time to send that thing out with some changes. It didn't work 20 years ago, it works now,
Right.
maybe.
I think what we'll do now, because I know there'll be some questions from the floor. Now, we usually have some roving mics. I think we will. Do we have roving mics? Yes, our roving mics. They will now rove. So if you have a question, please stick your hand up and we'll come and get the mics to you. Anyone like to kick off? Oh, right down the front here. Yeah. And if you don't mind introducing yourself, that would just be very nice for everyone else in the room.
Hi, my name is Donna. I am an alumni. I used to study Bachelor of Commerce, and I've been 3 years since I graduated. So my question is, I've read a lot, and I really have thought about getting into writing as a pastime, but I haven't done any creative writing courses. I don't have any, I guess, tangible educational experience on that. So what would be your best advice for someone like me who wants to get into it, but feel like they don't have that educational background coming from that?
Right, so how to get into creative writing if you don't have the background. Jill, I might throw that one to you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess I'm expected to say, come and do our courses. And certainly that's one thing to do, is to think of going back to tertiary education, and that's, that's one route to go down. The other thing would be, if you wanted to just think about it for a bit longer, is to keep reading in the area that you're interested in, or the kind of genre or style that you're interested in, and to keep writing. I mean, that's always just keep writing. Or the other thing is to find like-minded people and to start sharing your work. I mean, we work on part of that workshop model at the university, but you might want to do it at a more informal level and then think, oh, well, maybe I might take a further step and do a course. There are all sorts of short courses that you can do, as well as, the big university courses. But sometimes just working with like-minded people and sharing and getting some feedback and just getting the sense of how does this feel, putting it out there instead of just keeping it to yourself.
Oh, up the back.
Thank you. My name's Jim. I'm just a reader. My issue was the word failure. But in regard to the writers, my question is, if you're re-emitting your work, do you feel like you're sacrificing some integrity to get your work published? I applaud all of you, especially, sorry, I'm nervous, after Writers' Week, but I hate the thought of anyone disregarding your work and you thinking that you'd failed. That upsets me.
Who would like to have a go at that one? Heather.
I had a little bit of a problem hearing, actually.
Well, how do you feel? Sheila was saying he wasn't comfortable with the word failure and hated to think of, any of your works being thought of by you or others as failures. So
Okay.
if I understand correctly,
Yeah.
so how do you feel if you're told to maybe make some editorial changes?
So I once had a friend, Sonia Zekian, who's a writer around the same age as me. We've sort of started writing around the same time. We had a situation where we were both getting longlisted and shortlisted for things quite a lot, which sounds great, except for all of those things were unpublished manuscripts, and so we never were winning, so we weren't getting our books published. So at one point, we, after maybe 3 of them, we went, you know what, this isn't cool at all. There's nothing, we're not any better now than we were, or I guess any more present now in the public's eye than we were before any of these shortlistings. And she said, but all we're really doing is honing our skills. So it's an apprenticeship. So, the thing that I just said, I realized I needed at least 2 more years to work on. That was a new genre for me, a new form for me. That was a nonfiction sort of book of connected essays. And it's nothing I'd ever done before. And the process of it was it was such a blooming, brilliant time in my writing life. And I'm okay with knowing that it failed. I sent it to one publisher that I thought, this is the publisher I want for this. This is the one who will take care of it. It's got to be him. And he said, not right now. Not right now. It's not got to be me. And so that was one of the ones that hurt. But that also was the one that was very exciting to realize that I just hadn't gotten it right quite yet. But there's no way I'm giving up on that, because I love the project. And I loved doing the writing, and so I think I'm just not quite ready for it yet. And I have set books aside. I have put some in a drawer that I will never touch again. But that's honing the skill. So none of those are worthless to me, or failures, or anything like that.
Jill, did you want to add anything? You were nodding there with the books in a drawer.
Oh yes, I do have a novel which I will never see published. Yes, I think that I'm quite intrigued by this idea about failure, and I think about the famous phrase fail better, and it often is about what you do isn't a failure, it just didn't quite work at the particular moment. You might have sent it out or had a look at it again, but that's not to say you haven't learnt from it. You might not be able to salvage some of it in some other form, or it was just a step along the way, and that the next thing that you do, or the one after, might be the one that breaks for you. I mean, not everything that a writer writes is worth reading.
I know we've got a question here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Viv. I'm a student here at Adelaide, and I just wanted to ask, in terms of professional writing, is it a 9-to-5 job? Do you only write when inspiration strikes, or do you sit there for hours just waiting for something to write about? Just want to know what goes around that.
Matt, maybe you could start with that one. Is writing a 9-to-5 job?
So I write Monday to Friday in the mornings without fail. That's just a given. And I have to adjust that depending on what other jobs I'm doing in order to pay rent, etc. I guess there are different ways of looking at what counts as writing. So in the sense that I think someone who is truly passionate about writing is kind of always in process. It is 9 to 5, but there are very few people in the world that sort of have the hours from 9 to 5 to dedicate to any art form. So if your question is it sort of a disciplined craft, then my answer is yes, absolutely. The American novelist Michael Chabon talks about needing 3 things to write a novel. He says you need discipline, luck, and talent. You have no control over luck or talent, so you just have to focus on discipline and hope the others work themselves out. And that's kind of what I go with.
It's a good answer. And I know we've got a whole rash of other questions now. Where's our mic?
I might just, can I just comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I am trying to work full-time as a writer. So a couple of years ago I said, I'm going to try to be a full-time writer now. And because I don't have the 9-to-5 job, what I find is that I try to make an effort to write at least 3 hours a day. But I spend a lot of time hustling for money through grants and just so many applications. I'm just constantly trying to, and freelancing and so I can say I'm a full-time writer, but yeah, a lot of that involves so much business of writing and so much business of writing, so yeah.
Yep, the back there.
Hi, I'm Emily. I just have a question about how you go about editing your work. Do you write it all and then edit, or do you edit as you go, or do you just throw it out a window sometimes? Like, what's the best way to go about that?
Heather, I might start with you because you're in the process of editing right now. Yep.
So I really love editing, no matter if it's poetry or prose. I feel that sometimes my first draft is just a mess of ideas and overwritten sentences, and when you get to the editing part, that's the really fun part. That's where you get to see where everything connects and how the map itself works itself out, and then you get to start to feel really clever because you can connect all the points, and I just think that's such a joy to do the editing. I probably need to edit a heck of a lot more with poetry than I do, but I find I write really fast, and I edit really slowly. So,
Jill, do you edit your poems?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And there are times when I'm doing an initial draft when I might cross something out, if that's what you might call editing, and keep going, or I might quickly, just as I've written it, go back. But mostly I write it out by hand and type it up, and so it's still, in a sense, an unedited first version. But I've got poems that sit around for years, some of them not that long, and I keep going back at them and mucking around with them and moving lines around and changing words and all the rest of it. It's a process that, to me, is integral to the way I write, even though I can say I'm now editing rather than I'm writing. But sometimes I think it really is rewriting rather than editing. It can shift around a bit in poetry, certainly.
Another one down near the front here.
I'm Graham, a teacher of nearly 50 years experience. I have some concern about the use of the word like in putting it in the right syntax. You've probably encountered this with in verbal communication rather than written communication, I hope. But what's your experience with this term, using like in the wrong syntax, I think I put that right, with the students you teach? And is it an issue, and how do you address that issue? Do you know what I mean? Everything's like what?
Well, do you want to have a go at that?
How's it evolved, and how do we change this?
The way people speak to each other every day doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what they write. So that if that particular form, like we were out today, like, and we were really like, people talk like that. I don't, because I'm just from a generation that didn't. That's fine. I'm not going to change that. I find that mostly students don't use that kind of formulation in their formal work. Sometimes they may use it in a poem, and I might question that, or I might not, depending on what the poem's about and what it's trying to do. I detect that it annoys you, it annoys me, but you know, I'm not the arbiter of the way people speak. But certainly as a teacher, I'm interested in what they write, and I will comment on something like that if I think it's just not working. And that's the way I look at it. Yeah.
No, so I think as Jill's saying, there are two different worlds in a way, and we talk about the world of the real world of say our creative writing students, and then often the imaginary world or the history that they're drawing on, their personal history for their writing. Because you think a lot of our writers are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Their experiences tend to be drawn from the fairly narrow worlds that they've experienced to that point.
And language is changing all the time, so we can't be arbiters. If I was brought up speaking in a certain way, that doesn't mean I can say to the students, that's how you should speak. That's a long time ago now.
And we have another one on the end of the row there.
My name is Pat. I was just interested to hear Matt to talk about getting inspiration and maybe excited with your pencil and the sharpenings and your paper. And Jill too, with your fountain pen and the ink flowing. Do you think the children today are missing out a bit because there seems to be a lot of iPads used in schools, and maybe the pens and the papers seem to be disappearing?
Jill, I think you touched on that just in your introduction with the effect of technology. Pro and maybe working against the book, but yes.
Well, I mean, a pen and a pencil is technology. A paper is quite an old technology. So I like working with those tangible physical things, but an iPad is still a physical object, and it's just a different way of operating. It's a different tool. It's a different tool to a pencil or a fountain pen or a ballpoint pen. And so it may well be that it will cause different kinds of writing to be created. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I notice that my students use either the digital devices, but a lot of them are still writing on paper. It's a mixture, and I mean, I don't do it often, but I have actually used the little thing on my phone to sort of type up something really quickly if I see it and didn't have a piece of paper with me. And of course I use a computer. All writing these days is digital. I mean, to get something published, it has to be a digital file. You can't do it any other way, unless of course you've got an old printing press. And some people still do that, and that's great, but mostly it's all digital.
We might move on. Question down the front.
My name's Stephanie Russell. I'm a student here in counselling, and I love writing, so that's what I mean. And my question is, what was the most influential book for you as a writer that you've read, and why?
Can I start with Matt? Is that okay?
Probably I would have to break that down sort of through different periods of time. I mean, the first writing I ever did was just ripping off Tolkien's The Hobbit, and I rewrote it with pictures and just put myself in as the main character in every scene. So that was an important book for me. Obviously, it really occupied my imagination. As I got older, John Steinbeck's writings really impacted me, and I think it's because he writes about the west coast of North America, and even though I was further north in California, that sort of Pacific Northwest aesthetic, I think it had a huge impact on me, and it made me think that maybe it was possible to write about where I was from too in a meaningful way.
Heather, what was the most influential book for you?
It definitely goes back to those formative years of really discovering you love literature, I think, for me. So I wrote poetry first, and I was very much into rhythm, so I fell in love with people like T.S. Eliot and Maya Angelou, and people who use repetition and use rhyme, but not at the end of the lines, the internal rhymes, and that felt so natural and didn't feel practiced. And I still love those poets, and I still take those poetry books out, once a year, and look over some favorite poems and go, that's exactly why I love that poet. With novels, I'm always a little bit embarrassed to say, because I don't know how it's going to come across, but I fell in love with Henry Miller when I was 19 in Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer. And if I read him today, I would be so horrified at the way he depicts women and his relationships with women. But I think I would still just go, I just love his rhythm. It comes down to rhythm again. Just the way it felt like he sat down at his typewriter and he wrote the whole book in one sitting while he was drinking whiskey, and it just didn't stop. It felt like it was all energy. It was all about energy. And that was extremely pivotal author for me to read at that age of my life. And I ended up getting all his first editions, and I really put a lot of money and effort into him. and I'm still talking about it, even though it's a little bit like, oh, don't judge me. So it must not be too bad.
Well, that's a true obsession, I think. And Jill, what about, what was the most influential book or author for you?
I'm really trying to think, because there are so many things. I mean, if I'm thinking about as a child, it suddenly just occurred to me. I mean, a child, not even someone who was a teenager writing. I think, I'm old, so I had all those books written by A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh and House at Pooh Corner, which I think I've still got somewhere, and also the poetry as well, because I am a poet. So there were sort of these magical worlds, and when I was tiny, I thought these are ways of creating magical worlds out of poems and out of these little stories, and they had all the lovely little illustrations as well. And you could see, the 100-acre wood and all that sort of stuff. Not so now. And I think T.S. Eliot probably was a touchstone for me as a teenager. Kenneth Slessor, the great Australian poet, also. We studied him at school, and I don't know about any of you who went to school, you kind of run screaming from what you studied at school, but I loved it all. T.S. Eliot, John Donne, Kenneth Slessor, Judith Wright, those sorts of poets really meant a lot to me.
Yep.
Hi, my name's Olivia, and I do honours here in creative writing, so it's a relevant topic you're talking about. So I just want to say there's like this tension between loving writing and having this passion, and then also finding a job. And doing an arts degree, there's a lot of stigma about finding a job, and there's constant budget cuts, and you always have to do these like freelance things to, make money. And I was just wanting to know how to reconcile this like desire for like fulfillment as well as like money, because it's like they're two different things, and they always like come to mind when I'm like looking for opportunities.
That's a tough question, the desire, fulfillment, and the tension to find money. So, Jill, have a go at that one.
Right. I had to go out and work, as we do, and not all jobs are even 9 to 5. You've got to find jobs, and I moved around and did a lot of different things. But the sort of thing that Matt says, I think, is once you decide that you want to be a writer, you just try and find within your life somewhere, and it's not always going to be easy, that space and time or way of going about writing that allows you to keep doing it. I remember at one stage I was working in Sydney, I'm from Sydney, and I was working in the public sector, and sometimes it was a bit mad at work. But I had a 20-minute train journey to and from work, and even to actually sit down on the train and to do some writing then, and some of that stuff I ended up publishing years later, was just a way of training myself to observe, so to speak, training myself on the train to observe, listen to people, look out the window, and or go inside and think about things. But, if you have to, I'm a night person, so if I just have a lot of short sleeps and long nights of working, that's what I used to do, and that's what I sometimes still do.
We've just got time for one more question, so one more, yep. Oh, okay. Well, we'll squeeze in 2 quick questions.
Very quick, Matthew. How short can a short piece of writing be? My name is Anne-Marie. How short? You talk about doing short writing, short pieces. How short can it be? Are you talking about journalism items or more like vignette pieces? What sort of advice do you have for short writing?
So how short is short?
2 different forms. So I do a little bit of flash fiction, so-called flash fiction. That would be sort of less than 500 words. But most of my short stories, which I write and send out for publication, are around the 2,000 to 3,000 word mark. I find that that's just something that works for me.
Question. And very last question up the back there.
Right, test, cool. So basically, I'm an honours student at the University of South Australia. I recently wrote my thesis. It's just supposed to be 15,000 words, but I wrote 50,000 words, so cutting it down was fun. But basically my question is, when it comes to the process of writing, I tend to get lost within the research, and this is in either creative or for professional purposes, non-fiction. How do you delineate or separate research, editing, writing, and like kind of, I guess, not losing yourself within one of the separate tasks that come together to form a novel or fiction or any
Okay,
piece of
so
work?
how do you not lose yourself in the process?
Right. Can I? It's interesting you mentioned the word research, because certainly insofar as writing poetry, people think, oh, you just have this inspiration that floats down upon you and you write a poem. I can assure you that's not the case. And yes, sometimes you've got to think what kind of research that you do. But some of the research with poetry, creative research, isn't necessarily just book research, although I do book research. It's actually experimenting, so that's the actual process itself, but I call it experimenting like my colleagues here who work in the physical or social sciences. They do experiments too, which sometimes work and sometimes don't. My experiments might be with form or with structure or with theme and that kind of thing, so I don't know about separating it out, but sometimes, yes, you can get so caught up in the process, it's difficult to pull it apart. Unless you start to say, well, this bit over here is editing, that bit's research, and that bit is the writing. If that's helpful, that's a good thing, but sometimes you've just got to accept it. It's all the one thing.
And Matt and Heather, any final comment maybe on that point?
I find that when I do research for my writing, I do separate them physically. You know, I'll go, all right, well, so Tuesday, for instance, was always a day where once my kids got to high school, one of them, they got home an hour earlier. So it was like I couldn't get right into writing that day because I needed 3 hours and I wasn't going to get it. So that was always my research day. So I'd go, okay, so Tuesday will be the day that I do that, and then the rest of the time I'm going to do the writing. But ideally, the research is going to inspire the writing anyway. I think that's that is the beauty of research, is that it opens, obviously, opens up something in your mind that you didn't know, you didn't have in your mind the day before. And so the more you're thinking about it, the more you're going to want to explore and experiment with those ideas. So.
Well, we might leave it there. I'd say perhaps another response would be it's not a bad thing to get lost in the process. So just something to think about. Look, thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to thank our speakers. So Heather, thank you. Matt and Jill, I have a little something to give you afterwards. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We know there's a lot of things on at this time of the year, so I really appreciate you being here. That concludes this evening's event, but I hope some of you will make it back on the 9th of April for our next Research Tuesdays talk, something entirely different. What's the Buzz? A talk exploring the bee crisis and what it means for us here in Australia. So thank you, and please register early for that if you're interested. Have a good evening. Good night. Thank you.